gotten Proposition 13 on the California state referendum and said, let's cut property taxes by half, just like that. And this was the major source of local government revenue in the state, major source of a major source of school revenues for the schools. So this was the beginning of what has been called the taxpayers' revolt, or the revolution. Whereas by contrast, from roughly World War II on up to this point, American governments, especially local governments, had been growing, sort of like that. And that's what Vildovsky had focused on, but he mistakenly generalized this to the world. And so when Prop 13 came along and he saw he was wrong, he said, my God, I've got to change. And so he looked around, he found an anthropologist named Mary Douglas, and they did a book together called Risk, basically on risk. And what they did was adopt her fourfold classification of types of cultures, because she'd been studying and thinking. She was one of the main anthropologists in the world, along with Levi Strauss and Clifford Geertz. Mary Douglas was the third in England, Geertz in the U.S., Levi Strauss globally and in France. And they basically said, we want to study not just one little tribe, the Trobriand Islanders, or we don't want to just study one group in Brazil. We want to study human society, and we want to do it in a way that's more generalizable. Not to say that everybody's the same, but what are the more analytical dimensions which make people different? And so they had a fourfold type, which don't need to elaborate here. But basically, Vildovsky used and elaborated this for the second half of his entire career, basically that same fourfold table. But he applied it to American presidents from beginning to end. He applied in this book to budgeting processes from the Greeks up to the present. He stopped along the way, did two books on the ancient Jews based on reading it closely and seeing huge diversity within the Bible. That is, the Bible has all four of these kinds of political cultures where people are fighting against each other. Job against Charity, against Isaiah, and so forth. And so he then said, hey, we've had it. And so then in Oakland and in many places in California, just before Prop 13, the staff and the top political officials went all around and they put up signs. If you pass Prop 13, this swimming pool will be closed. This school will not be able to operate its cafeteria. We will not be able to have any sports any sports activities, etc., etc. So there were all kinds of signs everywhere. Specific services would be closed down. I taught a little course on this with a guy who was the city manager of Oakland. He and I were invited by all the Latin American, was an association of Latin American local governments. And they wanted to say, what's this Prop 13? What's this mean for Latin America and for the rest of the world? And so he published a book on this and what went on. But basically, people close to it said, nobody expected it at all, including the governor, Jerry, then same as more recently, Jerry Brown, and so Jerry Brown the day before said, don't vote for this, you'll destroy government. The next day he said, I will implement the voice of the people with all the power that's been given to me. I am against high taxes. Taxes are killing us. We have to change. And so in that sense, it was an amazing transformation in terms of his perspective for Vildovsky and Jerry Brown and for many people around the world who had not thought about seriously constraining policy making and spending. Seymour Martin Lipset, brilliant guy I've worked with, had a conference, and he and the smart people in the conference basically said the voters didn't know what they were doing. They really didn't mean to not to cut taxes this way, because look, if you ask them the questions, do you want the swimming pools? Do you want the sports facilities? Do you want better schools in general? Everybody says yes. So that in turn led to questions of how can you join the context with the allocations. And so the allocations, in a sense, are like the issue areas of Dahl or the arenas of Peterson. And so if you only ask do you want more, everybody says, yeah, I'd like more of all these good things. But if you say, we have a budget pie, and you can change the size of the slices, but you can't make the whole pie bigger. And in the case of California, we're going to cut that pie by half in terms of the property taxes. Okay. So this in turn led to basically the more visible attention being paid to citizens as qua citizens, as well as citizens qua service recipients, people who enjoy the swimming pools, as well as citizens as taxpayers. And there are big conflicts among these in the same citizens' heads. So they will say, sure, I want more swimming pools. I love swimming, but I can't. And so the strongest example was at exit polls when Prop 13 was being voted on, was by California state government officials. And the exit poll said, did you vote for Prop 13 or against it? I said, no, I voted for it. I mean, your government, your employer is the state of California. You voted for Prop 13. How could you have done that? You're voting against getting your own salary paid. What did they say? My home is more important than my job. Okay? So it was a small revolution. Wildavsky basically says from that, his takeaway is not to say this is anarchy or we can't, or that people are irrational or we can't do anything about it. Is to say what was different from the ancient Greeks, or if from one ancient Jewish king and in his different time periods and his different children, and how and why they constructed or variously reacted against to make a new context. Okay, that's the takeaway. The subtleties, scan more of the book. I gave you a quick overview of the city money story. Does anybody remember any of that? Do you have any questions on it? Or I'll pass over and maybe come back maybe if we have Q&A. Anybody remember anything? It's there. Okay. Take a look. These are the middle chapters. And the quick overview is that there were dramatic different stories within the book, within these processes going on semi-simultaneously, with, say, 65 through 68, 69, 70, where you had increasing mobilization of students against the draft because of and related to the Vietnam War. Second, you had government employees who were not unionized, as in Chicago and many other cities, and the federal government had sometimes said, and some state laws have said, government is too important and we prohibit unions in any government. That was a widespread law and a widespread belief among many Americans, that the public good should be your concern if you're working for the government, not your salary and seniority. Okay, the unions, and third, especially black power. And so there were riots, there were shootings, it was like 2 years ago, but much more, much worse. I live on Martin Luther King Drive. I could look out the window, I could see about 20 blocks going up in smoke. Practically all the little shops on King Drive, there were all kinds of little shops, liquor stores, dry cleaners, groceries, delicatessens. Almost all of those were attacked, burned, looted, and the owners basically left. And for more than 10 years, many of them were, and a few are still empty. That is, they've never been replaced. When they were replaced, they tended to be not by the largest ethnic group were American white Jews who were there. They didn't want any more of this. Next, we had Koreans, and the Korean Americans bought many of the little shops for maybe 5 to 10 years. They then had a huge anti-Korean reaction by African Americans in Los Angeles when you had big riots with the Taxpayers Revolt just in LA. That in turn, and so one of my smart PhD students is the head of the Korean American Association in Chicago, and he's done it for 20 years. He's never finished his PhD, but he's written chapters of what could be a PhD, which are wonderful, subtle characterizations of the Koreans offering groceries to the black churches to give to their parishioners, to try to make everybody feel closer. And they even tried to hold, because the Koreans are generally very religious. They go to church very, very actively. And as do African Americans, churches are them. And so they tried to hold some even religious meetings together. Though that was too hard, it didn't work. But basically there were efforts to collaborate, and the Korean associations no longer are helping Koreans. They're predominantly helping low-income African Americans and Mexican immigrants, even though it's called the Korean Association of Chicago. So the ethnic meaning can be deeply transformed, as with the castes in India. So the castes in India are doing things a little bit like this. Okay. So with this transformation, we had mayors, for instance, saying, I don't know what citizens really want. We got some people saying this. But basically, most mayors nationally, and so this is when we estimated the regression coefficient, so when you control income, poverty, a bunch of other things, before this late 60s period, many local characteristics did not have a big impact. Unionization, neighborhood groups, civic groups, the strength of the party. These variables were all insignificant in explaining growth or decline of government spending. In that period in the middle, 68, 70, 72, it really ended in 1974 with our budget data, but politically it happened earlier. It started with the 1965 New York riot in Harlem. Many mayors wanted to be responsive, and a dramatic, visible example is Lori Lightfoot. She captures much of the spirit of the concerns of mayors in those years, and the most dramatic single movement is Black Lives Matter today. But many of the themes are adapted and extended from 1968. And so Black Lives Matter is asking for more of this, more of that, and the like. And many mayors have said yes. And what we're now getting right in the U.S. today is very similar to what happened after 1974. What was that? Yeah.
Basically, local taxpayers' revolts. Basically, local taxpayers' revolts. You have like the San Diego City Council election is one example of a pre-Prop 13 local effect of people saying we don't want to pay these high taxes. Is that what you're talking
Yes,
about?
yes, exactly. I mean, that's the simple big point, and that was the shock to Aaron Vildovsky as it happened in his Oakland. The most visible controversial cases right now are the big cities, New York, Chicago, LA, Atlanta, who've had African American women mayors. And New York was perhaps the most policy explicit in being, let's say, closer to the progressive so-called nationally, but who has just won the election in New York? Anybody know? Nobody has an idea. An African American former policeman who was head of the Brooklyn Local Government Association. There are 5 counties in New York. Each has its own fairly strong local government. He was twice elected the head of Brooklyn. So he's got, if you will, in the Democratic Party lingo of the president, he's a centrist. But he's not a strong leftist progressive, as Blasio has been, the current mayor, who was defeated by the new mayor. Okay, so this is, and I point to this because this is what happened nationally after 1974. Basically, you had new officials who were elected, in some cases directly because of the taxpayers. In many others, it was more moderate, but they generally were more fiscally conservative. So we will have an example of this kind of mayor next Monday in class. His name is Bill Morris, and he was mayor of Waukegan for 2 terms. He went from being the most left liberal. He was a state senator from the northern suburbs. He was a very activist leftist. He passed a number of leftist bills. He then ran for mayor, and he was in his mid-20s, very young, very smart. He rang roughly 40,000 doorbells, asking the citizens what they want, what he could do to be more responsive than that guy who's not now responsive. And he shifted his position away. He did what Vildovsky did. Vildovsky, for him, it's a model. For Morris, it's a question of what do I do to win the election, and what do I do to govern. And basically, he remained socially liberal on all of his social issues, for African Americans, for women, for minorities, for tolerance, etc. But he reversed himself on the fiscal. He had been a big spending, high tax, raise the taxes always. He then reversed himself because he saw so many citizens didn't want that, even if they would like to have more of this. So how did he put them together? And here he was very explicit. Improve productivity. We've got so much slack, so much poor managed police, and firemen who were sitting around sleeping and so forth. So he fought with the unions, he fought with staff, and this in turn led to those kinds of conflicts. But he did it because the citizens, he felt, and he had that doorbell ringing experience. And similarly, local governments. Okay, so this happened first in California in 1978. 2 years later, the same thing happened in referenda in Michigan and Massachusetts. Taxachusetts, place so-called. They all passed the same referenda, roughly the same percentages in California. So the citizens of California and Michigan and Massachusetts all said cut property taxes by half. The reaction of the mayor of Boston was what? Did he do the same as Jerry Brown? Or Bill Morris? Jerry Brown and Bill Morris switched on fiscal policy. Kevin White said, the citizens have not understood. They want good schools. They want all of those services we're providing. They just didn't understand, and they don't really know how much they're paying in taxes. So I'm requesting that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts loan us the amount of money that we would need to continue spending at the same level. And what happened? The Commonwealth said, yes, we agree. And they loaned the city the money to continue what they had done. It's the opposite of California. Okay, so state, local differences, individuals, all can make a very dramatically different context. Yep.
When we look at the case study of, I think Bill Moore's in Michigan, correct? When we look at the contrast of California and Boston and Massachusetts in general, can we attribute that kind of like thinking by Kevin White to the idea of like different political cultures that we discussed earlier, particularly the idea that like Massachusetts has that moralist streak of government should be involved in people's lives, whereas California, particularly the California of the late 20th century, was much more dominated by the individualism that, by kind of individualist streaks that would kind of be amenable to, all right, no more spending, government's a business. Is it worth reading into those political cultures when we look at like decisions to cut spending versus get creative with not cutting spending?
I could try to answer on a more ad hoc level, but what is the answer to that if anybody has looked in the Urban Innovation book or the moving ahead to the Barbara Furman comparison of two cities and her then building of a new framework? Anybody looked ahead to any of that? No. Okay. The answer is yes, in part, I would say. And I'll say in part because you find going up the West Coast and within California, you can find all three political cultures. You can find all three, and so certainly at the city level. And that in part was a guiding question. Okay, let me answer it in conjunction with the Browning, Marshall, and Tabb, which has 1 star. It's called Racial Politics in American Cities. And it's gone through, I think, 3 editions. The first edition was right after, in conjunction with these big changes in the late 60s. And they studied 10 towns in the Bay Area, and they showed how they were all over the lot in terms of reactions to trying to make government more responsive. More responsive in California meant abolishing or weakening the city manager. The city manager was the strong leader. The mayor was either absent or weak, very weak. And the style of California government in general was engineering. There's a best way to do it, and we'll do it the best, efficient, cheapest way. Don't ask questions. We know. We're the technology people. Okay, so the reaction against that by especially Mexicans, African Americans, and women was, we want you in the city council to be more responsive to participation and especially to newly mobilized minority groups. And so they had this kind of battle going on. And in these 10 towns, roughly 6 embraced the changes, and they elected many more women, African Americans, Mexican activists. And they began to implement higher spending policies in the same way that I described from city money. The other 4 were maybe, I think 2 basically didn't change. And 2 were somewhere trying to compromise in the middle. So it's not as if yet it's a yes or no answer to your question, but there were variations within even the Bay Area local governments, in part because people would sort themselves out. They'd move to a different suburb where you got more either higher spending or lower spending and things which were more close to what you might want. Not one day after the next, but slowly over time, these kinds of changes have been happening. Second edition is here, which stresses more LA, where you had huge conflicts and nasty difficulties with Republicans then fighting against a wide range of, so I mean, so LA has got all kinds of things going on, like it's different for sure, but it's got the diversity of a Chicago or a New York and having many, many different things happening in the same place. So each of these are better, I would say, to break up. Don't say LA is this way and New York is that. Look at some of the specifics within the subgroups is what we were trying to do. And the Urban Innovation book does this by basically focusing on the strength of the African American driven groups on the one hand, and the various kinds of reactions on the other. The most extreme being, let's say, those linked to the Sierra Club. I tried to get information on the specifics of different kinds of civic groups nationally, such as, you know, what's the position of the Sierra Club in Bloomington, Illinois, or in Waco, Texas, and they didn't give us policy data, but they did give us membership. So we got local Sierra Club membership data for the whole U.S. I wrote similarly to, you know, maybe 15 other civic groups, unions and others. They wouldn't give us a single thing, and nobody would tell. But so then we did case studies, and I mentioned some of the diversity which we've had in this classroom. Okay, basically these two types worked and work now, I would say, in quite differentiated ways, in ways that we've seen in my anecdotes about. I'll just leave it this way for now. Bronzeville, as an archetypical over time Black Power neighborhood, versus parts of Hyde Park and then parts of the North Side, where the Sierra Club, the environmentalists, the vegan, the Birkenstock, sandals, etc. Health is more visible. Okay, so these are types. It's not as if anybody fits in any one type, but they're subtypes whose dynamics we can analyze and make sense of. And they are found all around the world. You have organic food. People are there. It's called more artisanal in France. So even though they had great traditional French food, it wasn't organic. And so artisanal is the version of not being just healthy, but also done in a way that has the artisan's expertise of subtlety, of taste. And so they can charge twice as much as the normal vegan. So the lifestyle and the cost of living in Paris are something like twice those in New York. Okay, very, very expensive. Tokyo. So that is the U.S. domestic variations are good to look at and be sensitive to, but they're still small compared to these things going on globally. All right. I mentioned Paris. I'll go continue down the list. Walter Benjamin. What's the big point about Benjamin that I've mentioned maybe too briefly, but you have one big takeaway, what should that be? Okay. Benjamin, some said, was the most brilliant intellectual of Weimar Germany. He was trained in literature. He's a literary critic. He wrote about Goethe. He wrote about photography in the 19th century. He wrote about music. Then he wrote books on Berlin, his native Berlin, and then on Moscow, just Moscow. Then he went to Paris, and he could see Marx and he was a Marxist, self-declared social democrat than Marxist. He could see Marx working pretty well in Berlin and Moscow. When he got to Paris, it didn't work. What's wrong with Paris? And it was a fundamental intellectual challenge to him. Why isn't Marxism working? And so what was his major source of evidence that he began to study? Look what was in the minds of people who were thinking, who were critical, who were thoughtful, and they also happened to be intellectuals and novelists. Balzac in the beginning, but the main example he studied in detail, hundreds of pages, was Baudelaire, the poet. But he also wrote essays on streets and street life and how people are reacting against the bourgeoisie, the oppressive bourgeoisie. But he also edited a journal called Wagnerian Studies. Wagner came in through Baudelaire. The arts, culture, musical themes, the Gesamtkunstwerk, all this stuff was there. And so Benjamin then was reading this stuff. Then along came the Surrealists. So he started with, Baudelaire's been dead for 40, 50 years. Let's look at the Surrealists. This is more contemporary, 1920s, 1930s. And they were wild bohemians. They were flaunting all kinds of, breaking all the rules of aesthetics as well as of lifestyle. But his bottom line, well, basically, he most of his works were unpublished when he was living. Harvard University Press published them only about 10 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. And they then became bestsellers in English departments and parts of the social science, let's say anthropology, sociology. And he's brilliant. So he can write an essay and he'll start. And so the reading, we have only short reading here called Paris, Capital of the 19th Century. And he makes a simple point that when, as I mentioned, it's not in his statement. I've added this myself. Around 1800, when they said let's build some factories because that's what the English and the Germans are doing in Paris, and let's have factory production. So they built a couple of factories and smoke came out. People in Paris, stop! We can't have smoke on Paris. This is a beautiful city. And people said, well, you can't have an industrial revolution if you don't have any smoke or factories. I said, well, maybe we don't want an industrial revolution. And they didn't. They stopped the smoke. They never had industry in the British or German or American way. Then we get to post-industrial America, Germany, China, when we have the drop in manufacturing jobs and unions by 50% from the 50s to 2000 roughly, which we point out, that's the foundation. This is the destruction of the left party base of the Labour Party in England, of the parts of the traditional Daley I Democratic Party background. So Daley too switched his politics. Some people, and so I pointed out, Lipset did a paper, he went over many of the socialist parties of the world, did the same thing. Okay. So Benjamin, staying with Paris, was trying to explain what happened. How did Paris succeed economically, socially, culturally? It kept bringing in the British and the Germans, the Russians who would leave the Bolshevik reactions, but the English and the Germans who had a whole lot of money would build castles or villas and so forth in Paris or nearby Paris. And they'd spend their money from the big factories in the Paris restaurants and the dance halls and the paintings and the wines and the cheese and the dresses, and they'd take those back to Germany and back to England, back to the Art Institute of Chicago. They're Americans. The French didn't buy up the Impressionist paintings. The Americans did. Some smart Americans right here bought them and gave them when they died to the Art Institute. So we've got a fantastic collection in Washington, New York, and Chicago of the French Impressions. Okay. How did Benjamin make a theoretical sense out of this? He's writing for 2 or 3 audiences, so it's tricky to read, but the first audience is the Orthodox Marxists, we'll say. And so for them, he uses class consciousness, class conflict, mobilization for the revolution. And the reason we had Haussmann building those big boulevards in Paris was so that the French armies could march back and forth on them and put down any revolution. So it was seen as the bourgeoisie, capitalist domination holding down the working class. Okay, that's there in the transformations of 19th century and early 20th century Paris. At the same time, he says, we have the rise of these little shops that were selling cravat or umbrellas or red shoes. And it rains, as I've said in Paris, half the year. And so what they did was, when they had steel and glass invented basically in the early 19th century, and they covered over, so you've seen that's the title of his book, The Arcade Project. So the idea was cover over the streets, keep the rain off the shoppers, and then we have, I'll put it on in case your French is not. Le flaneur. What's the flaneur? Initially, literally, maybe a guy with a top hat, a ballerina on his arm, looking in the windows of high-end shops where they would look for something for him or for her, and they would look at through the windows, and they might go in, but they often would not. And they were walking around exploring the aesthetic reactions of consumption. Consumption, not capital, not investment, not production, not factories, consumption. And that's what brought the Germans and the English and the Americans to Paris, and the Russians to Paris. So the consumer economy was the same as what we have now in Chicago. When you knock on the door of City Hall today, what's the major industry in Chicago? Tourism. And what brings the tourists?
Entertainment.
Exactly. Entertainment and tourism was explicitly stated by Daly 2 in 1994. I had people who were his top staff, and I would say 1993, the year before they came to this class, I said, what does the mayor say about what you're doing? So, he's interested. They came back the next year. I said, how does the mayor react to what you're doing? We make 5 suggestions and the mayor does 10 things. Seriously. So Chicago revolted in its own way, not against capital, but to invest capital in consumption. And Chicago is and so that's why Laurie Lightfoot and others are deeply worried about the looting of North Michigan Avenue, which was covered in the press, that this will suppress the degree to which families, couples, friends will come to a convention and stay on through the weekend in the way that they stayed on in Benjamin's Paris. That consumption and lifestyle is not something which is fixed. You can go wherever you want. And so that migration linked to consumption is the big point. What happened after the arcade? In the end of the 19th century, they developed department stores. And the big change, papers on this by women analyzing the specifics, that women would shop alone in Paris in the department stores by around 1890, 1900. No longer did they have a gentleman with a top hat or whatever else. They didn't care about security. And they were independent enough. They made their own shopping decisions, and they could shop for their families and for their husbands. Where were their husbands or their top hat wearers going? Interesting data on this. They'd gone to men's clubs that engaged in things like fencing and hunting, macho stuff. Okay. Transformations of gender roles in conjunction with aesthetics and lifestyle. And so the flaneur, in a literal sense, had declined and been replaced by department stores. And what came after department stores? We had someone from China talking about this last session. Wants to do a paper on this in China. What did he mention? Malls, exactly. So malls are a bigger and better version of a department store. If you're in a suburban area, you've got cars, then the mall becomes an easy way to load up from 3 or 4 little shops in the mall, put them in your car and drive home. Okay. Then what may come after that? Still being controversially discussed. Amazon, online shopping, COVID. People no longer hang around in malls to the same degree, but they look at the traffic. Now it's called Amazon Prime. Those trucks are blocking Hyde Park, the little streets, every day. Okay, so the modes have transformed, but the point is the aesthetics of what people want in their consumption style have become more and more important. And Benjamin was just the first person coming from a solid, well-recognized Marxist party background to say, Marx didn't say everything, but he mixed this in with the rest enough. Nevertheless, it was enough that Adorno and Horkheimer said, we don't think we want to give you a doctorate here at Frankfurt. If you want to go somewhere else, you can do that. So he didn't get a doctorate at Frankfurt, although he could and should have perhaps. But he argued with them. So they had meetings of Brecht, Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin. And they were all basically Marxists, but they disagreed over cultural specifics. They disagreed especially over Bohemia. Should we embrace Bohemia as part of the lifestyle of the left? Or should we say, no, that's false consciousness? They divided. So Brecht and Benjamin were in favor of embracing the surrealists, the German version of that. The Thomas Mann, a non-Marxist, Lukács, who was the man who spent the money, the Russians then after 1933 were supporting the German left, and Adorno. Adorno was very critical on, or let's say conservative, socially, aesthetically conservative, on not recognizing or not featuring aesthetically a Bohemian orientation, which you had in Brecht and in Benjamin. Okay, so I can go on, but any questions on what I've said? Okay, let me touch more on a few more of these readings, but go ahead and we can discuss anything that seems, or let me just read carefully to see what I've said. One year I had 2 students sat in the front row that questioned all the time. When we got to Benjamin, I said, that's not what we hear about Benjamin when we take a course in Paris on this. And we know, we have Parisian press, we're Parisians. I said, well, read the text closely. It's all there. But the normal reading of Benjamin is that he was a Marxist. Pure and simple. Read between the lines. He was adding lots. And that's what people have been reading since. Aaron Wildavsky's paper here, Cultural Theory of Leadership, is a dramatic shift from his earlier paper on the budgetary process. Instead, He says we really have very different kinds of mayors, very different kinds of political leaders, and they can be put into these kinds of boxes. Hierarchy, or egalitarian, or strong state, or more civic, and so forth. Paul Schumacher's paper is a study of Lawrence, Kansas, college town. The big perspective on business leadership we've read from Hunter and Stone. So we have the simple version, let's say Hunter himself said, I was a Stalinist Marxist. Stone does not say that. He says, I'm a political scientist, and we have a regime. And the regime includes professionals and others. And yes, the business leadership is important, but it's not directly and simply in terms of its, and so he's really talking about his city of Atlanta. By contrast, in Dallas and Houston, they have open, direct business leadership. So this was only for a couple of decades or more, but you had, but just so you know it exists, you can see this if you look in those time periods. There's a book by Bob Lineberry on this. Lots of Texans got very interested in these things, and studied them, and then compared them with Chicago and with other locations, mostly in case studies of this sort. Business leaders, Dallas and Houston, would say, take out full-page advertisements. We support the following city council members, these people for national and state office, and we're opposed this mayor. Don't vote for her. And her was, later on, Kathy Whitmire. Kathy Whitmire organized against the so-called, what she called the Old Boys Network, not just she, but others did. And she won, because there are lots of new people who moved in from Boston and Chicago and LA who went to Houston, working in some in oil, but especially in space, all kinds of high-tech kinds of stuff. So there were many non-old boys, but basically the old business elite was destroyed, not just by her, that happened before, but my point is the image that business wants growth because growth will generate profits, and that's what capitalism is all about. Those statements you have from even Adorno and Horkheimer when they wrote about Hollywood. You have it from Peterson when he writes about city limits. You have it from in the next section. You have the same thing from Logan and Molich, their book Urban Fortunes. Simple neo-Marxist kind of statement. Schumacher said, let's ask the citizens. I mean, if the driver of these growth policies and business investment and having city government do these growth things, if the city is a growth machine, the title of a paper by Molich, let's ask what the citizens think about it. And so Schumacher went around, lots of citizens were surveyed, lots of kinds of issues, but many were all about how about housing, how about growth, how about having the government spend more in order to generate more jobs and more growth, and basically that's what the citizens wanted. Bottom line, there was no conflict between the business elite and the citizens. If there's no conflict, and maybe there was a minimal conflict back in Paris, or between Waco on the one hand and Cambridge, Mass on the other. Cities differ, citizens differ, and if you don't pay explicit attention in the whole community power tradition, ignore the citizens, except for Dahl began, but he brought them in with a lot of other things. Whereas later people like Schumacher said, pay a lot of attention to the citizens. and he measured them in this way. Then I did a book with him, a little book for the American Political Science Association on teaching, how to teach political science, modeling citizens and getting citizen data more actively, and then seeing how it changes by city. So that's a sub-tradition which was sparked by Schumacher's paper here. Okay, I've gotten us up to the Furman, but I'm going to stop here. We got just a couple of minutes. Let's just have any kind of little discussion. I'll call on you if you don't ask a question, including our TAs if you want. But you folks always have good ideas. One, of course, is how's the American South different? Or where are there variations in these regards? Yes.
When we begin to apply something like Walter's, like series of concepts like Walter mentioned, understanding.
Yeah, sir, a little slower. You said theories of culture?
When we begin to apply like theories like those of Walter Benjamin to cities in our own research, how do we put that into practice? How do we kind of sit down and start, like if we were looking at like contemporary, I don't know, San Francisco, how do we start just unraveling existing trends, existing cultures, and applying the frameworks of these thinkers in a way that like allows us as like researchers starting out to really kind of be effective in doing this?
I published a paper in a journal called Feminista, and it's called Bike Ethnography. I ride my bike all around the city every other night, 2 hours. And I did it through COVID every other night. I did it through the riots and stuff downtown. Different areas. I wouldn't go right through where they were shooting, but I'd find some place. I sit on committees of neighborhoods, and we had one group it was the Tax Increment Financing Organization advising Mayor Toni Preckwinkle. She was then the alderman, and basically we would approve or disapprove every development project for a new shop, a new residential building, a new park, all kinds of things. So any serious, because it had to have zoning approval. Okay, and we had a whole lot of these for several years. Bronzeville was the fastest growing for a year or two. It was the fastest improving value of resale value of homes neighborhood in all of Chicago. It went down for years, but then it boomed up a bit, and then it started going down again. That is, and especially requests coming to our committee died. So we'd say, how come nobody's doing any building in okay, what did the 15 people on the committee who were smart shopkeepers, political advisors, civic leaders, what did they say? They all said, except for me, they all said, we have a national recession. We can't do anything in Bronzeville. We have to wait for the national recession to be over. So what did I do? I got on my bike. I biked back and forth in the Bronzeville main shopping streets, and I counted the number of retail stores that were closed or had signs up, for rent. Then I did the same thing in Hyde Park, on 53rd Street, and maybe basically a couple of shopping streets mostly 53rd Street in 55th, probably 55th and 53rd, and a couple more. Hyde Park was about 80%, there were about 20% of the shops in Hyde Park said for rent. Same national recession. National recession is what the national folks talk about it in the New York Times and in Congress. But when you get down, not just to Chicago, but you get down to two neighborhoods immediately adjacent to one another, you have the same alderman representing both of those neighborhoods in her, she has to vote for both of them. She couldn't say and she's smart, she couldn't say it's a national recession, there's nothing we can do. The policy lesson was, what can Bronzeville do that Hyde Park is doing better? So more careful analysis. Flaneur, I was on my bike. You can walk around. That is what I didn't stress enough, that the flaneur both in Balzac and Benjamin was not just buying something. They were thinking and analyzing why and how would this be in conflict with other political and social and all kinds of things. So that is you have maybe not a social science journal article, but the flaneur was an intellectual, basically, a consumer-oriented intellectual reflecting on aesthetics. And you can have this, and this is written about in especially the French, but also in the American Southern tradition of parties and sociability, entertaining in people's homes, where people will talk about the problems of the world or whatever. And the probably we could look for it, but I went to the New Orleans history of the city of New Orleans. You get open discussion of the Ku Klux Klan. How do we deal with the Yankees who are coming in? But that is, it wasn't just anti-Yankee. It was, they tried to have these. That is, they don't hide the violence and the difficulties and the racism, but they said who's supporting what and why, and how did it change in a 2-3 year period. Okay, so and just to join with this again, what do they say about the men in the outsiders coming to New Orleans? They say, these men don't work. All they do is ride horseback and go to parties, dances, and talk. People talk a lot. Okay. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Professor.
Take a look in these themes. I mean, I'm giving. Okay, I won't summarize again. Thank you. We got 2 tripods. Want me to take this and stop it?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.